Well, if you were here last Sunday, you will know that we started a new series looking at Jesus' teaching in the Sermon on the Mount called Jesus Shaped Life. And I mentioned earlier about the how God cares for the sparrows. And in the same way, how much more will he clothe you? Those words come from the Sermon on the Mount. It's also the place in which Jesus taught his disciples to pray, as I mentioned, saying, "Our Father in heaven." So when we take this teaching, this is our Heavenly Father speaking to us and showing us how he wants to relate to us as Father and how we are to relate to him in response. So the Sermon on the Mount is about the lifestyle of a follower of Jesus. And Jesus begins his sermon with 8 radical statements about blessedness, what it means to be blessed in his upside-down kingdom. Last week we looked at how God blesses those who are poor in spirit, those who recognize that they are wholly dependent upon him, and about the true comfort that comes to those who are grieved, who mourn about the things that grieve God. And so this week we're going to look at 4 more of the Beatitudes, as they are called. Remember, the beat is from the Latin, which means blessed. And the first of these is, "Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth." Now, Jesus spoke these words in a society where bullying was a way of life. Even the concept of human rights didn't exist. There was no institutional protection of the weak through any pensions or health service or legal aid, nothing like that. And for many people today, to be meek is to join the rank of life's losers. It's an undesirable and unfashionable quality. Confidence and assertiveness are what are needed. You could hardly succeed on, if you've seen The Apprentice, it's not something I've watched other than very occasionally, if you've seen The Apprentice, Alan Sugar's program, you could hardly succeed on that if you are meek. That's not the way to get ahead in the world today. The unwritten rule of our times is not to show any weakness. So when Jesus says, "Blessed are the meek," we need to realize that the Greek word that he uses does not mean spineless or feeble. Like someone who say, "Blessed are the meek," if that's okay with everyone else. This is not a kind of false meekness that comes from a low self-esteem. This is about true humility. It's the opposite of being arrogant and self-seeking. It means being broken. Not in the sense of a glass being broken, but more like a horse being broken and tamed. It's about strength under submission. Meekness is essentially having a true view of yourself. It's about having nothing to prove. It's not about being mild-mannered. Jesus was perhaps the greatest example, I'm sure was the greatest example of meekness. And yet in the temple, with the money changers, he doesn't act in what we might normally think of as a meek kind of way. But Jesus was meek. Jesus hung out with the weak, with the poor, with the outcasts of society. He washed his disciples' feet. Even though he was equal with God, he humbled himself and became human. taking on the form of the nature of a servant in the ultimate demonstration of true meekness. Was that weakness? Or was it great strength under submission? The Apostle Paul, before he became a Christian, was a strong, bold, arrogant leader in persecuting the followers of Jesus. He was on a personal campaign to kill them. He was proud to be a top-notch Pharisee with all the right pedigree. But after he met Jesus on the Damascus Road, we see a total transformation in his character. He now says, I'm glad to boast about my weaknesses and in the insults, hardships, persecutions and troubles that I suffer for Christ. For when I am weak, then I am strong. This is one of the extraordinary mysteries of being a Christian. When we come before God in meekness, then we're able to be filled with the supernatural strength of God, far beyond what any human being alone could muster. And Jesus says, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Now, some of Jesus' audience may have thought this blessing was about the physical land of Israel. And when they thought about the promised land, they thought about all that it represented: prosperity and protection and supply and security. But Jesus had a different land in mind with those same promises. People might tell us that meek people will never succeed. But we can afford to be meek in this life because it's not all there is. Those who give up power and privilege for Jesus will receive riches beyond comprehension in the age to come, which includes a new earth. It may mean a little sacrifice now, but the longer gain is immense. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. And then Jesus says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Now, in order to be re-elected, politicians usually do research to find out, what do the public want to hear? So these days they'll probably talk about prosperity and health and security and environmental protection and global justice. But nowhere do you find a politician talking about righteousness. It's just on no one's radar. And by contrast, in Jesus' day, Judea was full of people claiming to be righteous. And yet today it simply isn't one of society's goals, to such an extent that people have no understanding of what it is, or if they have an understanding, it's usually a misunderstanding. Righteousness has two aspects. Firstly, it's about being called into a relationship with God and living out the implications of that relationship. To be right with God simply means to be in right relationship with Him. It's just like any other right relationship with a human person. It means to have no unresolved issues, no grievances, no unsettled debts. And yet Jesus says, and he says it a little bit later after this part of the sermon, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. Why did he say that? Because I think that kind of righteousness of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law is about conformity to rules. But Christian righteousness that is God-given is an inner righteousness that works itself out in living in conformity to God's will, longing to live righteously in God's sight. We should have an increasing sense of a need for God, to be like him. See, it's not those who are satisfied with their own righteousness, but rather those who hunger and thirst for a righteousness that they don't feel that they have, who will be satisfied. And so as followers of Jesus, we need to go beyond God's verdict because of Jesus' death on the cross of not guilty, and then live out that righteous life. Not just receive God's righteousness, but live it out. Because this is more than a private and personal affair. It includes hungering for righteousness to prevail in the world. Christians are to be committed to hunger for righteousness in the world because it pleases a righteous God. Jesus calls us to whole life discipleship, to seeing people from his perspective, seeing people with the eyes of his heart, being concerned about what we can do to change things. Jesus' words indicate an ardent desire, a life focus on this that puts everything into second place, so that satisfying this hunger and thirst becomes more important than anything else. But I guess the problem is that many of us are simply not that desperate. So we might need to ask God to give us a genuine discontent with everything that's unlike God. We hunger because we need to be sustained. We thirst because we need to be refreshed. Loss of appetite is one of the first signs of health diminishing. Loss of appetite for righteousness may arise through weariness, through disappointment, through cynicism, through complacency, through distraction. You see, Jesus isn't saying we need to want righteousness, but to hunger and thirst for it, to seek it intensely. Nothing worth achieving was ever reached without some kind of hungering and thirsting and sacrifice. Slavery was not ended by a few quickly dashed off letters of protest. Tyrannies were not overthrown by a man walking around with a placard for a few minutes. This is about tenacity and perseverance and passion. Unless we really hunger and thirst for righteousness, unrighteousness will triumph. And Jesus says, for they will be filled. What does it mean to be filled? Well, I think the promise is that anyone who has a genuine longing to be like Jesus in motivation and attitudes, words and actions shall be satisfied. The gospel of Jesus Christ has made provision to satisfy all who truly desire these things. Jesus says, whoever comes to me will never grow hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. And he says, whoever drinks this water will be thirsty again, talking about, natural water. But whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst. And he says, let anyone who is thirsty come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as the scripture has said, streams of living water will flow from within them. The image of a divine feast is used more than once by Jesus to illustrate the satisfactions of the kingdom of God. So for those that are passionate to live a righteous life and to see the righteousness of God prevail in the world, Jesus doesn't simply say that you'll have something to eat and drink. He says you'll be filled. Those who yearn for God and his righteousness above all else will certainly have their desires satisfied. You see, any attempts to find happiness through power, possessions, or pleasure will inevitably cheat us. It will be like drinking salt water, intensifying our thirst instead of satisfying it. One of the characteristics of how Jesus describes hell is the presence of a hunger and a thirst that can never be satisfied. But here in this beatitude we have heaven's counterpart. It's a paradox. How can you be happy and dissatisfied at the same time? How can you be hungry and satisfied at the same time? Content and yet discontent? But that's what happens, because in this life our hunger will never be fully satisfied, nor will our thirst be fully quenched. The hunger and the thirst of your life that cannot be satisfied by anything in this world is the constant beckoning of God to remember that you were actually made for another world. You were made for God. So in the book of Revelation, we read that. No more hunger, no more thirst. God leads us to springs of living water and wipes every tear from our eyes. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. And Jesus says, blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. When we've been cheated or hurt by someone, our natural reaction is to give them what they deserve back. See that in our two young boys. One of them pushes the other one pushes back. It always seems to happen. It's a natural human response. But it's those that show mercy that will receive mercy. It's not that we can earn God's mercy, but rather the fact that we forgive is evidence that we have been forgiven by God. We may be all too familiar in our lives with what we call a vicious circle. But this beatitude is about what we might call a virtuous circle. When we see really how much God has forgiven us, we should not fail to have mercy on others. The preacher, the 18th century preacher, who eventually his teachings led to the foundation of the Methodist Church, John Wesley, once confronted someone who was about to discipline one of his servants harshly. And the servant's master said to Wesley, "The rascal should have taken care not to have served me so, for I never forgive." To which Wesley replied, "Then I hope, sir, that you never sin." We're also called to be merciful to those in need. Jesus gives us the example of the victim in the parable of the Good Samaritan. And we're called to look out for those in need, those who are hungry, those who are sick, those who are outcast, those who are unpopular, those who are lonely, and have mercy on them. Look at this response of Jesus to the thief who was dying next to him and asked Jesus to remember him when he came into his kingdom. Jesus says, "Truly today I tell you, you will be with me in paradise." Mercy is a characteristic of God himself. Those who are poor in spirit and mourn it, those who are meek, those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, realize how much they actually need God's mercy. They're like the opposite of a fault finder, someone who's always seemingly looking out for and dwelling on the faults of other people. As we have mercy on others, we become increasingly aware of the mercy of God in our own lives. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. And finally today, blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Pure. What do you think about what comes to mind when you think about the word pure? When we think about purity and contamination in the modern West, we tend to think about hygiene, the transmission of disease. But in Jesus' day, it meant being clean from spiritual contamination, about what they should and shouldn't do. And generations of religious leaders had multiplied and elaborated upon what the Old Testament law had spelt out. So you could be rendered ritually impure by such things as making contact with a dead body, touching certain animals, having certain skin diseases, and if you were a woman, by giving birth to a child or menstruating. And the contamination was serious. It meant you couldn't take part in temple worship. And in some cases, you had to keep yourself temporarily separate from your friends and your relatives. People cared passionately about purity because they thought through that kind of external purity, they would be in a right relationship with God. And the religious leaders, in particular the strict Pharisees, looked for a purity of lifestyle that consisted of religious ceremony and outward conformity. For them it was more like, blessed are the outwardly clean, for they shall see God. They specialised in defining the rules in exactly what was ritually clean and unclean. They put reputation above character. And as someone has said, reputation is what people think we are. Character is what God knows we are. The Greek word translated as pure in English has two senses. Clean, not being dirty, lacking contamination, and undivided, having integrity towards God and towards others, seeing the world as God sees it. And this beatitude includes both aspects. It's about the need to have a clean centre to our lives and a clear focus. Jesus is referring to that core, that control centre of our being, which motivates our actions, our manners, our words. It's about our inner nature, our thoughts, our feelings. The Old Testament, it says, above all else, guard your heart, for it is a wellspring of life. And Jesus says, out of the overflow of the mouth, the heart speaks. All that you are is an expression of who you are at the heart of your being. So it's not enough just to clean up on the outside. What we are in the deep, private recesses of our lives, that's what Jesus cares about the most. And Jesus didn't come into the world simply because we have a few bad habits that need to be broken. He came into the world because we have unclean hearts that need to be purified. The psalmist says, teach me your way, O Lord, and I will walk in your truth. Give me an undivided heart that I may fear your name. See, it's so easy to be distracted in our Christian life because we're bombarded daily with so much stuff that threatens to take us away from purity of heart. Jesus says, blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Of course, we should allow that word see to only go so far. Seeing God's not about a visual experience. It means knowing him. It means becoming acquainted with him. It means having him close to us. What this means is we no longer experience God just as an abstract concept discussed by theologians and philosophers, he suddenly becomes real. And death will, of course, enable us to see God in a way that's impossible in this life. By comparison with what we will experience then, even the best earthly happiness is temporary in duration, is limited in its quality, is vulnerable by its nature. But seeing God, as Jesus puts it here, is about getting a God-like vision of the world, and for that we need to be pure in heart. It's about seeing life with different eyes. That while the rest of the population are focused on the joys and challenges of life from a human perspective, the pure in heart are those who perceive the activity of God, the presence of God, the purpose of God, the glory and wonder of God, even in the midst of those same challenges and joys of everyday human life that others have. Only the pure in heart can see God, because they're the only ones whose vision is not clouded. The more our lives are focused on God, the more we will see him. The more creation will speak to us. The more his word will speak to us. The more even the adverse circumstances of our life speak and sharpen our vision of God. So 4 radical statements. They're the way of Jesus. And this is not about determining in the future, from now on I'm going to be more meek, I'm going to hunger and thirst for righteousness, I'm going to be more merciful, and I'm going to be more pure from now on. If we approach it that way, we will never have any chance of getting there. But rather this is about forgiveness. It's about receiving God's grace. It's about asking that we might truly have God's heart within us, enabling us then to be motivated by the values of Jesus' upside-down kingdom. And as in a moment or two we share in communion, we're going to be asking God to place his heart in us afresh, to make him more like him. So as we prepare to do that, we're going to sing together, "Your grace is enough," because that's what we need. That's the only way that we can live as God intended, is through the grace of God shown to us in sending Jesus for us.